My name is Nia. I am 32 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary in prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and tried desperately to earn a fraction of the love that was effortlessly handed to my younger sister Chloe. But no matter what I achieved or how hard I worked, I was always the designated outsider, the scapegoat expected to carry the emotional and financial burdens of the family while receiving absolutely none of the respect. That painful reality was never more apparent than on the morning my entire life turned upside down. It was exactly 7 in the morning on a Tuesday when my phone vibrated violently against my wooden nightstand. I grabbed it, blinking against the harsh glare of the screen. It was an automated high-priority alert from my private bank. A deposit had just cleared. I rubbed my eyes, assuming the early morning light was playing tricks on my vision or that the banking app was experiencing a severe glitch. The notification read, "Incoming wire transfer $9 million." My breath hitched in my throat. I immediately sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I dialed my private banker immediately, my hands shaking slightly as I held the phone to my ear. When he finally answered, his voice was tight and overly professional, lacking his usual warm greeting. I asked him to verify the sender, fully expecting him to apologize and explain that there had been a massive routing error in their system. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke. "Ma'am, this is not a mistake. The sender is the Reginald Sterling Trust. Your biometric signature cleared the final security protocols, and the funds are legally yours." I froze completely, the phone feeling like a brick in my hand. Reginald Sterling. That was my biological father. The same man my mother Elaine swore was a deadbeat addict who ran off when I was a baby and never looked back. She had spent my entire life painting him as a monster, using his absence as a weapon to remind me that I was fundamentally unwanted. I ended the call without saying another word and sat in the deafening quiet of my bedroom, the crushing weight of a $9 million secret pressing down on my chest. I had to process this mind-bending reality while simultaneously preparing for my mandatory attendance at our family Sunday dinner later that week. I knew I could not let the shock paralyze me. Instead of letting the anxiety consume my thoughts, I channeled the exact same cold, calculating energy that made me a top-tier crisis manager and software developer. I build secure systems and fix massive public relations messes for high-net-worth clients. It is a highly specialized skill set I undoubtedly developed from constantly cleaning up my family's toxic, chaotic disasters my entire life. When Sunday afternoon finally arrived, I slid into the driver's seat of my matte black Porsche. I bought this car in cash last year, a quiet but powerful testament to my relentless grind and late nights writing code. But to my family, my success was just an annoying inconvenience they preferred to ignore or downplay at every opportunity. The drive to my mother's house in the suburbs was a familiar route paved with decades of dread. The house looked exactly the same as it always did, pristine and perfectly maintained on the outside, suffocating and deeply judgmental on the inside. I braced myself, taking a deep breath before I walked through the heavy oak front door. The rich smell of baked macaroni and cheese-candied yams and fried chicken hit me instantly, a classic Sunday dinner spread. But there was absolutely no warmth in the greeting I received. Instantly, the blatant disrespect began. My mother, Elaine, barely even looked up from the dining room table as I walked into the foyer. Before I could even say hello, she immediately pointed her finger at the dining chair where I had just set my designer wool coat. "Move your things right now, Nia. DeAndre needs to sit there. The man of the house is exhausted from working hard all day, and he needs the most comfortable seat." I looked over at DeAndre, my sister Chloe's husband. He was currently dripping in fake designer labels, sporting a counterfeit Gucci belt with a buckle that was entirely too shiny, and a loudly ticking watch that was definitely not a real Rolex. He gave me an incredibly smug, dismissive look and dropped his heavy frame into the chair I had just cleared, not offering a single word of thanks. DeAndre was a self-proclaimed crypto entrepreneur and day trader who spent significantly more time posting aggressive motivational quotes on social media than actually generating any real revenue. Chloe fluttered around him like a dedicated servant, handing him a massive plate of food before she even acknowledged my presence in the room. Then she finally looked over at me, her eyes sweeping up and down my tailored outfit with a thinly veiled sneer. She sighed dramatically. "You really should smile more, Nia. Maybe if you did, you would find a strong provider too, and you would not have to work so hard at whatever little computer coding job you do." Elaine nodded vigorously in agreement, casually stirring her glass of iced sweet tea. "Speaking of your job, Nia, make sure you leave $400 on the kitchen counter before you go back to the city tonight. You need to cover the grocery bill for this dinner. Since you are single and have no real responsibilities or a husband to care for, it is the absolute least you can do to support this family." I did not yell. I did not throw a fit. I did not give them the emotional reaction they were so desperately trying to provoke. I simply smiled a cold, practiced smile, reached into my leather purse and pulled out my black American Express card. I set it on the dining table with a soft, deliberate click. As I slid the card toward my mother, I made a casual, razor-sharp comment about how DeAndre's daily entrepreneurial grind looked an awful lot like the time Elaine forced me to co-sign Chloe's first car loan out of college. A massive loan I ended up paying off entirely by myself, just so my own credit score would not be completely destroyed by their financial negligence. DeAndre's face flushed with sudden hot anger. He slammed his fork down on his ceramic plate so hard I thought it might shatter, puffing out his chest as he glared at me across the table. "You think you are so incredibly smart with your little condescending remarks, Nia? But you have absolutely no idea what kind of major moves I'm making behind the scenes. In fact, you all should know that I just closed a massive, highly secret investment deal this morning, $9 million to be exact. The paperwork is done and we are buying a luxury mansion in Buckhead next month." The entire dining room went completely silent. The sound of silverware clinking against plates stopped abruptly. Chloe squealed with delight, throwing her arms around DeAndre's neck, while Elaine beamed with intense pride, looking at him as if he were a king. But my blood ran completely cold. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. $9 million. That was the exact, highly specific amount of money that had mysteriously landed in my private bank account just a few days prior. It was too massive of a number to be a simple coincidence. I looked across the table at DeAndre. I really looked at him this time, shifting my perspective from an annoyed sister-in-law to a forensic crisis manager. I noticed the nervous, glistening sweat forming on his forehead despite his arrogant posture. I noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he picked up his glass of water. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of emotion. I asked him simply, "What is the name of the firm funding this $9 million deal, DeAndre? Who exactly are your investors?" DeAndre snapped back defensively, crossing his arms tight over his chest and avoiding my direct gaze. "It is under a strict non-disclosure agreement. I cannot discuss the details with outsiders. You would not understand high-level corporate finance anyway, Naya. Just stick to your little keyboards and let the real bosses handle the millions." He laughed nervously, but the panic in his eyes was unmistakable. I did not push the issue further. I just picked up my coffee mug, took a slow sip, and let the silence stretch out, knowing with absolute certainty that the empire of lies my family had built was about to come crashing down. I set my coffee mug back down on its saucer. The sharp clink of the ceramic echoed in the suffocating quiet of the dining room. Nobody dared to speak. DeAndre was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his eyes darting toward the front window as if he expected someone to burst through the glass. Chloe busied herself by aggressively cutting her chicken, her jaw tight, while my mother Elaine stared at me with pure venom. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to scream, to cry, to throw an emotional fit so they could easily dismiss me as the jealous, unhinged sister. But I refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my tailored trousers. I announced that I had an early morning meeting with a major client and needed to head back to the city. Elaine scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she crossed her arms over her chest. Of course you are leaving early, Nia. You always run away when the conversation turns to real success. Just make sure that $400 payment actually clears. I would hate for your little computer job to bounce a check on us. I did not even dignify her insult with a response. I simply grabbed my designer coat, turned on my heel, and walked out the front door without saying a single goodbye. The crisp autumn air hit my face the moment I stepped onto the porch, instantly cooling the heat of the anger that was beginning to boil just beneath my skin. I marched down the long paved driveway, the gravel crunching loudly beneath my boots. Every step I took away from that house felt like shedding a physical weight. But the anxiety gnawing at my stomach was only growing stronger. $9 million. That massive, impossible number replayed in my mind on an endless loop. I unlocked my Porsche, the sleek headlights flashing sharply in the fading evening light, and slid into the driver's seat. I locked the doors immediately. I did not start the engine. I could not drive. My hands were gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned completely white. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I leaned my head back against the cold leather headrest, closing my eyes and forcing myself to take 3 deep, measured breaths. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 7, exhale for 8. It was a grounding technique I used before walking into hostile boardrooms, and I desperately needed it now. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately before I lost my nerve. Being a software developer and a crisis manager means I do not rely on hope assumptions or family loyalties. I rely on cold, hard data. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my encrypted work laptop, resting it heavily on the center console. The harsh white glow of the screen illuminated the dark interior of my car. I connected to my secure mobile hotspot, my fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard out of pure muscle memory. If DeAndre had actually closed a $9 million deal, there would be a digital footprint. An ego that massive simply could not exist without leaving a trail of public records or corporate filings. I bypassed the standard search engines and ran a custom data scraping script I had coded myself. A black terminal window popped open on my screen. Lines of green code began rushing downward in a dizzying waterfall as my script bypassed superficial firewalls. I watched the IP addresses ping across the server, tracing digital signatures back to their origins. It logged directly into the premium investigative databases I used for my high-net-worth clients. These were highly secure portals that pulled real-time data from state tax boards, federal registries, and banking compliance networks. I typed in DeAndre's full legal name and hit enter. The loading icon spun for what felt like an eternity. When the results populated on the screen, I actually let out a harsh laugh. The screen was completely empty. DeAndre did not hold a single active executive position. He had no registered broker licenses. He did not even have a basic commercial banking profile anywhere in the country. The self-proclaimed crypto genius, who was supposedly buying a luxury mansion in Buckhead, had less financial standing than a college freshman. But I knew the $9 million sitting in my private account was very real. If DeAndre was connected to that exact sum of money, he had to be operating under a completely different corporate entity. I narrowed my eyes at the glowing screen, shifting my investigative strategy. If I could not find him through his direct name, I would trace his physical address. I entered the address of the luxury apartment he shared with Chloe, cross-referencing it with recent commercial filings in the state of Georgia. This time, the database hit a massive, horrifying goldmine. A long list of limited liability companies flooded my screen in rapid succession. Apex Horizon Ventures, Quantum Crypto Solutions, Next Gen Digital Holdings. There were at least 12 different shell companies, all registered within the last 6 months, and all using DeAndre and Chloe's residential address as their primary operating headquarters. I clicked on the most recent filing, an LLC incorporated just 3 weeks ago. I downloaded the official state articles of organization, quickly scanning the densely packed legal jargon. My eyes landed on the section listing the registered agent and the financial guarantor. My heart completely stopped beating. The air instantly vanished from my lungs, leaving me gasping in the silent car. The name on the official document was not DeAndre. It was not Chloe. The name printed in stark bold letters as the sole financial guarantor for this shady shell company was Nia Sterling. My name. I leaned closer to the screen, my mind racing frantically to comprehend what I was seeing. I pulled up the secondary tax documents attached to the initial filing. There it was, staring right back at me. My full legal name, my exact date of birth, and my social security number weaponized to legally bind me to whatever fraudulent activities DeAndre was currently orchestrating. A wave of profound, suffocating nausea washed over me. My hands began to shake uncontrollably over the keyboard. This was not a simple lie told over a Sunday dinner to boost his fragile ego in front of my mother. This was federal identity theft. This was a highly calculated criminal operation designed specifically to use my pristine credit and spotless financial history as a human shield for his phantom businesses. If these companies went bankrupt or faced federal tax evasion charges, I would be the one dragged out of my office in handcuffs, not him. The pieces of the puzzle began snapping together with terrifying clarity. DeAndre had never asked me for my social security number. We barely spoke outside of forced family gatherings. There was only one person on the entire planet who had access to that highly sensitive information: my mother. Elaine had kept a heavy locked metal file cabinet in her basement for decades. It was filled with old tax returns, original birth certificates, and medical records from when I was a teenager. When I turned 18 and moved out, I begged her to hand my original documents over to me. She flatly refused, claiming she needed them for her own emergency records and that I was too irresponsible to manage my own paperwork. I remembered the exact look of haughty contempt on her face that day in the basement. She had stood in front of that locked cabinet like a prison guard, telling me I was ungrateful for even asking. I had foolishly trusted that even her deeply ingrained cruelty had basic legal boundaries. I was entirely wrong. Elaine had literally given DeAndre my social security number to help him secure illegal funding, completely bypassing my consent and offering up my financial life as a sacrificial lamb for her favorite son-in-law. She had undoubtedly convinced herself it was totally fine, assuming DeAndre would strike it rich, and I would never even find out about the fraud. I sat in the silent darkness of my car, the pale blue light from the laptop screen reflecting off my face. The burning rage I felt was no longer hot and explosive. It was absolute zero. It was a cold, precise fury that completely cleared my mind of any lingering familial guilt. DeAndre had used my identity to set up fraudulent accounts, and when the Reginald Sterling Trust tried to wire my $9 million inheritance, the banking system detected my biometric data and routed the massive sum to my actual account instead of his fake shell companies. That was why he was sweating tonight. He thought the money was his. He thought his fraudulent deal had gone through successfully, completely unaware that the funds had been intercepted by the rightful owner. He accidentally triggered the trap, and now my money was safely behind my bank's encrypted firewall. I closed the laptop with a definitive snap. I did not start crying. I did not call my mother to scream at her. Amateurs react emotionally to betrayal, but crisis managers build airtight legal cases before they ever strike back. DeAndre wanted to play high-stakes corporate games using my name, so I was going to teach him exactly what happens when you steal from someone who builds digital fortresses for a living. I reached for my phone and dialed my private corporate attorney. The dial tone rang twice before he picked up. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I told him we had a massive corporate fraud situation requiring immediate intervention. I instructed him to draft an ironclad cease and desist order, prepare a full forensic audit of 12 fraudulent LLCs, and stand by for a potential federal injunction first thing Monday morning. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply affirmed the instructions with a sharp professional tone, assuring me that the paperwork would be filed with the courts before DeAndre even woke up. I hung up the phone, feeling the absolute power of having an elite legal team at my disposal. I started the engine of my Porsche, the powerful roar of the exhaust shattering the quiet street. DeAndre thought he had outsmarted me. He thought he could steal my identity, claim my inheritance, and humiliate me at a dinner table I had just paid for. This was no longer just about protecting my inheritance or proving my worth to a family that despised me. This was about total, uncompromising destruction of their toxic empire. I was going to let them dig their own graves, hand them the shovels, and watch them bury themselves under the weight of their own arrogance. But as I shifted into gear and sped away from my mother's house into the night, a dangerous smile crossed my face. The real war had just begun. Monday morning arrived with a sharp, unrelenting brightness that perfectly matched my mood. I walked into the sleek glass-walled lobby of my downtown corporate crisis management firm at exactly 7:30. The pristine white marble floors clicked under my heels, a rhythmic reminder of the empire I had built entirely on my own. My senior legal counsel, David, was already waiting for me in my corner office. We did not exchange pleasantries. I set my matcha latte on the desk, and he slid a thick bound folder across the polished glass surface. The forensic audit was complete. It confirmed everything I had uncovered in my car the night before, but the physical evidence was even more damning. The IP addresses used to register the fraudulent shell companies traced directly back to the Wi-Fi network at my mother's house. Elaine had not just handed over my social security number from some old tax document. She had actively sat at her kitchen table, sipping her sweet tea while DeAndre used her computer to forge my signature on federal documents. Instead of calling the police immediately and blowing the operation, I instructed David to quietly build an airtight, inescapable trap. I wanted federal wire fraud charges, identity theft, and corporate malfeasance all wrapped up with a neat little bow. I wanted them to dig their own graves so deep they would never see the sun again. We finalized the strategy, signed the necessary legal injunctions, and David left my office just as my staff began arriving for the day. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, opening my emails and preparing for a normal workday. But I knew peace was not on the agenda. At exactly 10:15, the heavy glass doors of my firm flew open with a violent crash. My receptionist, Keisha, a sharp young woman who handled high-stress situations daily, jumped up from her desk in alarm. Before security could even react, Chloe and DeAndre came storming through the reception area, completely ignoring Keisha's firm instructions to stop and sign in. They marched directly down the main hallway toward my corner office, making an absolute scene in front of my entire staff. Junior analysts and senior account managers stopped what they were doing, peering out of their glass cubicles to watch the unfolding disaster. I did not flinch. I did not stand up. I simply pressed the button under my desk to lock my computer screen and waited for them to burst in. DeAndre threw my office door open so hard the handle left a visible dent in the drywall. He marched right up to my desk, his face contorted in a mixture of arrogant rage and absolute panic. He slammed both of his heavy hands down on my pristine glass desk, rattling my expensive metal pen holder. "Listen to me very carefully, Nia," he growled, his voice echoing out into the silent hallway. "I know you saw the money hit your account. Those funds were supposed to go to my new holding company. The investors made a massive clerical error. They accidentally routed the $9 million to your personal account because your name was listed on some of the older guarantor paperwork as a backup. I need you to open your banking app right now and wire my money back to my corporate account before my investors pull the entire deal." His lie was so incredibly transparent it was almost insulting to my intelligence. An accident. A clerical error. He was actually trying to convince a professional corporate crisis manager that a major financial institution had accidentally wired $9 million across state lines without verifying the beneficiary. I looked at him with absolute deadpan silence. I did not offer a single word of confirmation or denial about the money. My silence infuriated them even more. Chloe stepped out from behind DeAndre, her face flushed red, playing her favorite role of the eternal victim. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her voice trembling with manufactured tears. "You are always doing this, Nia. You are so incredibly jealous of my marriage and DeAndre's success that you are literally trying to ruin our lives. You cannot stand to see anyone else in this family happy. It is just like my sweet 16 all over again." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by her staggering delusion. When Chloe turned 16, Elaine threw her a massive $10,000 country club bash we absolutely could not afford. Instead of spending my weekend blowing up balloons and fetching ice for a sister who treated me like absolute garbage, I stayed in my room studying for my SATs because I knew an academic scholarship was my only ticket out of that toxic house. Chloe had cried to our mother, claiming my absence ruined her entire birthday. Elaine grounded me for a month. Now, 13 years later, she was using the exact same emotional manipulation tactics, crying in the middle of my professional office, expecting me to instantly cave to her insane demands. I let her finish her dramatic monologue. I let DeAndre stand there, breathing heavily, waiting for me to apologize and hand over the funds. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Instead of reacting to their unhinged behavior, I leaned back slowly in my ergonomic chair, completely unbothered by their presence. I maintained unbroken eye contact with DeAndre as I reached out and opened my top desk drawer. I pulled out a crisp white envelope, perfectly sealed, and placed my hand flat on top of it. I slid it smoothly across the glass surface until it stopped right in front of DeAndre's trembling fingers. It was clearly not a check. It was definitely not a bank transfer confirmation receipt. DeAndre snatched it up eagerly, tearing the envelope open with careless force. His eyes rapidly scanned the printed document, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. It was a formal, legally binding cease and desist order drafted and stamped by my attorney just an hour prior. It explicitly forbade DeAndre or any of his associated shell companies from utilizing my name, likeness, or social security number for any financial transactions, and demanded an immediate cessation of all fraudulent corporate activities. It also outlined the severe federal penalties for identity theft. DeAndre opened his mouth, his jaw working silently as he struggled to find the words to express his mounting terror. He finally realized that I knew exactly what he had done. Before he could even formulate a coherent sentence to explode in anger, the private landline on my desk began ringing loudly. The piercing sound of the phone ringing shattered the heavy silence in my office. The caller ID display flashed with a name I knew all too well. It was my mother, Elaine. I did not rush to pick it up. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the look of pure dread washing over DeAndre and Chloe as they stared at the legal document in their hands. Finally, I reached out and pressed the speakerphone button, ensuring every single word would be broadcast clearly across the room. Elaine's voice blasted through the speaker, shrill, hysterical, and dripping with venom. "Nia, you vindictive, selfish little girl!" she screamed, not even pausing to say hello. "DeAndre texted me that you are refusing to give him his money. You are deliberately tearing this family apart over pure spite. You have always been a bitter, jealous child, and now you are trying to ruin your sister's future just because you have nothing going on in your own pathetic life. Send that boy his money right now, or you will never step foot in my house again. Do you hear me?" I listened to her unhinged rant with a calm, detached fascination. She was so blinded by her favoritism for Chloe that she was actively demanding I participate in a massive federal crime to save her golden child from the consequences of a fraudulent lifestyle. She had absolutely no idea that her precious son-in-law was standing right in front of me, holding a legal document that proved he was nothing more than a common thief. I looked up at DeAndre, whose eyes were wide with panic, silently begging me not to reveal the truth to Elaine just yet. I smiled coldly, leaning closer to the microphone on my desk. "I am not tearing this family apart, Mother," I replied softly, my voice steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "I am simply cleaning up the mess you helped create." I pressed the end call button, cutting off her screeching voice mid-sentence, leaving DeAndre and Chloe standing completely frozen in the deafening silence of their own impending ruin. The absolute shock on their faces confirmed one clear, undeniable truth. They finally understood that I was no longer their helpless victim, and the severe consequences of their reckless actions were now completely inescapable. I did not give them a single second to recover from the shock. I reached beneath my desk and pressed the silent alarm button wired directly to the building's security desk. Less than 30 seconds later, two large, imposing security guards stepped into my office, their expressions stern and uncompromising. I pointed at DeAndre and Chloe without breaking eye contact with them. "Escort these two individuals out of the building immediately," I instructed the guards, my tone entirely professional and devoid of sympathy. "If they attempt to return, call the police and have them arrested for trespassing." Chloe gasped, clutching her designer handbag, as if I had just physically struck her. "You cannot do this to us!" she shrieked, her voice cracking in a desperate attempt to maintain her manufactured dignity. "We are family." I leaned forward, my hands resting flat on the cool glass of my desk. "You ceased being my family the moment you decided my identity was yours to steal," I replied smoothly. "Get out of my office." DeAndre tried to puff out his chest, attempting to salvage some shred of his shattered pride. But one of the guards firmly grabbed his arm. The fight instantly drained out of him. He let himself be led out of my office, dragging a sobbing Chloe behind him. I watched through the glass walls as they were humiliated in front of my entire staff, paraded out the front doors like common criminals. Once the heavy glass doors swung shut behind them, I did not waste any time celebrating the small victory. I grabbed my coat, told my receptionist to cancel my afternoon meetings, and walked out to the parking garage. I had a destination in mind, one that held the final pieces to this massive twisted puzzle. I drove my Porsche across town to the prestigious financial district, pulling up to a towering glass skyscraper. I took the elevator to the 42nd floor, stepping out into the hushed mahogany-paneled reception area of the law firm that handled the Reginald Sterling Trust. I had called ahead from the car. The senior estate attorney, a distinguished older gentleman named Arthur Vance, was waiting for me in his corner office overlooking the city. He greeted me with a warm, empathetic smile that immediately disarmed my usual defensive posture. He motioned for me to sit in a plush leather chair across from his massive oak desk. "I have been waiting for your call for a very long time, Nia," he said softly, folding his hands together. "Your father instructed me to release the funds to you on your 32nd birthday, but he also left specific instructions regarding the delivery of his personal effects." Arthur stood up and walked over to a heavy wall safe. He turned the dial, pulled the heavy metal door open, and extracted a large, beautifully crafted mahogany box. He set it gently on the desk between us, sliding a small brass key toward me. I stared at the box, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That is the truth your mother tried to bury," Arthur replied, leaning back in his chair. "Go ahead. Open it." I picked up the small brass key with trembling fingers and unlocked the latch. I lifted the heavy wooden lid, expecting to find legal documents or cold financial ledgers. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with envelopes. Hundreds of them. They were bundled together by year with thick rubber bands. I reached in and pulled out a stack from the very bottom. The paper was slightly yellowed with age. I opened the first envelope. It was a birthday card for a 5-year-old girl, filled with a long handwritten letter in neat, precise cursive. "Happy birthday to my brilliant, beautiful Nia," the letter began. I read the words, my eyes scanning the pages as the air was slowly sucked out of the room. I opened another envelope, then another. There were graduation cards, middle school congratulatory notes, and countless letters detailing his life, his pride in my academic achievements, and his deep, agonizing sorrow over being kept away from me. I looked up at Arthur, completely bewildered. "My mother told me he was a deadbeat," I said, my voice shaking slightly. She told me he was a drug addict who ran away and never paid a dime to support us. Arthur sighed heavily, a look of profound sadness crossing his face. Reginald Sterling was never an addict, Nia. He was one of the most brilliant forensic accountants on the East Coast. He built a highly successful career, uncovering corporate fraud and tracking hidden assets. When he and your mother divorced, things turned incredibly bitter. Elaine manipulated the court system using fabricated abuse allegations to secure full custody and place a restraining order against him. But Reginald never stopped fighting, and he never stopped providing. Arthur reached into the box and pulled out a thick manila folder. He opened it, revealing decades of certified bank statements, cleared checks, and wire transfer receipts. He paid child support every single month for 20 years, Arthur explained, tapping the paper. He paid above and beyond the court-mandated amount. He sent money for your college fund, money for braces, money for clothes. Your mother intercepted every single letter. She cashed every single check. She legally boxed him out of your life while quietly bleeding him dry. I sat frozen, staring at the undeniable financial proof of my mother's absolute depravity. The sickening realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Elaine had not just lied to me. She had stolen the love and support of a father who desperately wanted me. And worse, I instantly knew exactly where all that money had gone. The massive Sweet 16 party at the country club, the private pageant coaches, the designer clothes, the expensive car loans. Elaine had used my father's money specifically meant for me to fund Chloe's lavish golden child lifestyle. She had built Chloe's entire privileged existence on the back of my stolen inheritance, all while looking me in the eye and telling me I was a financial burden. The betrayal was so deep, so fundamentally evil, it almost defied human comprehension. But Arthur was not finished. He leaned forward, his expression shifting from empathetic to deadly serious. Your father may have been legally blocked from seeing you, but as a forensic accountant, he kept very close tabs on your mother's household. Arthur continued. He knew exactly what Elaine was doing. He watched Chloe grow into a spoiled, entitled adult, and he watched Elaine bring DeAndre into the fold. He investigated DeAndre's background years ago and realized immediately that the man was a dangerous grifter. When Reginald was diagnosed with terminal cancer last year, he knew he had to protect you one final time. He knew that if he simply left you $9 million in a standard will, Elaine and DeAndre would find a way to manipulate you, guilt you, or steal it outright. So he designed a trap. Arthur turned his computer monitor so I could see the screen. It displayed a complex flowchart of encrypted banking pathways. The $9 million was not just an inheritance, Nia. It was bait, Arthur explained, pointing to the screen. Reginald structured the trust so that the payout would look like a vulnerable, easily accessible corporate investment account. He intentionally leaked a breadcrumb trail of financial documents that he knew DeAndre's shady network would eventually find. He made it look incredibly tempting, practically begging a greedy, desperate amateur like DeAndre to try and claim it. But Reginald built a failsafe. The trust required highly advanced biometric verification to finalize the transfer. If anyone tried to route the money using only a stolen social security number or forged signatures, the system would instantly lock them out, trigger a silent alarm to federal authorities, and automatically reroute the funds directly into your heavily secured private account. I sat back in my chair, my mind spinning as the sheer brilliance of my father's plan washed over me. Reginald Sterling had reached from beyond the grave to protect me and expose the parasites feeding on my life. DeAndre had not just stumbled onto my social security number. He had actively attempted to hack into a multi-million-dollar trust fund. He had tried to steal my inheritance to fund his fake empire, completely unaware that he was walking blindly into a forensic accountant's masterfully designed snare. The biometric security had saved my money, but the attempt itself was a massive federal crime. And by filing those fraudulent, limited liability company documents with the state of Georgia, DeAndre had provided the exact legal evidence needed to lock him away for decades. But as the initial shock began to subside, a new, much darker question began to form in my mind. The pieces fit together perfectly, but the timeline felt entirely too rushed, too desperate. DeAndre was greedy, yes, but attempting to hack a secured trust fund was a massive escalation from his usual petty crypto scams. The sheer panic I had seen in his eyes when I handed him the cease and desist order was not just the fear of being caught in a lie. It was the raw, primal terror of a man who believed his life was in imminent danger. I looked at Arthur, my crisis manager instincts fully activated. "Why now?" I asked quietly, my eyes narrowing. "DeAndre is arrogant, but he is also a coward. To attempt a cyber heist of $9 million requires a level of desperation that goes way beyond wanting to buy a mansion in Buckhead. Something is forcing his hand. He needs exactly $9 million right this second, and he is willing to risk federal prison to get it." Arthur's expression darkened, and he closed the manila folder slowly. "I do not know the answer to that, Nia," he replied gravely. "But whoever he owes that money to, they are clearly not the kind of people who accept apologies or missed deadlines. You need to be extremely careful. DeAndre is cornered, and a cornered rat will do anything to survive." I left the law firm with the heavy mahogany box securely tucked under my arm, the weight of 20 years of stolen love pressing against my chest. As I walked out into the busy city streets, the puzzle was nearly complete. My father had given me the weapon to destroy them. But I still needed to figure out exactly what kind of monsters were hunting DeAndre in the dark, and why he was so desperate for exactly $9 million right now. The week passed in a calculating silence. I did not hear a single word from my mother Chloe or DeAndre. Their absence was not a surrender, it was the quiet before a public storm. I knew exactly where they would try to stage their next attack. Sunday morning arrived, and I found myself pulling into the sprawling, heavily manicured parking lot of Greater Grace Fellowship, our family's megachurch. I had stopped attending regular services years ago, finding the theatrical displays of wealth and self-righteous judgment exhausting. But today, I needed to keep up appearances. More importantly, I needed to gather intel. DeAndre was running out of time, and desperate men make sloppy mistakes when they think they have an audience on their side. I walked through the massive double-glass doors into the cavernous, brightly lit lobby. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, freshly printed programs, and the hum of hundreds of congregants dressed in their Sunday best. I slipped into a pew near the back, observing my family sitting near the front row. DeAndre looked physically ill. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, and he sweated profusely despite the air conditioning. He kept checking his phone, his leg bouncing with a frantic, terrified energy. Whatever deadline he was facing, it was breathing right down his neck. When the 2-hour service finally concluded, the congregation began spilling out into the expansive marble lobby. I stood near the grand staircase waiting. It did not take long. My mother Elaine locked eyes with me across the room. She did not approach quietly. She began her performance while she was still 20 feet away. "Oh Lord, please help my deeply troubled daughter," she wailed, her voice projecting over the gentle hum of post-service chatter. Heads began to turn immediately, conversations abruptly stopped. Elaine closed the distance between us, dragging a visibly shaking Chloe by the hand with DeAndre trailing nervously behind them. Elaine threw her hands up toward the vaulted ceiling, tears streaming down her perfectly powdered face. She fell to her knees, clutching my coat. "Please God, soften her greedy dark soul," she cried loudly, ensuring every elder could hear. "Cast out the demons of selfishness that have taken root in her heart. She is trying to destroy her own sister's family. She is withholding DeAndre's hard-earned investment money out of pure hateful spite." A crowd quickly formed a tight circle around us. Congregants whispered behind their hands, their eyes wide with scandalous delight. Chloe buried her face in DeAndre's chest, sobbing dramatically into a lace tissue, playing the role of the helpless, persecuted wife to absolute perfection. They were using the judgmental weight of the church community to publicly shame me into compliance. Before I could step back, a heavy hand clamped down firmly on my shoulder. I turned my head to see Reverend Davis, the charismatic silver-haired leader of Greater Grace Fellowship. He was a man who wore $5,000 custom suits and drove a Bentley, all funded by the tithes of the working-class congregation. He looked down with patronizing disappointment. His grip was uncomfortably tight, asserting his supposed moral authority. "Nia, my child. This behavior is deeply troubling, Reverend Davis intoned, his deep baritone voice resonating through the hushed lobby. The sin of theft and the sin of pride are poisons that will rot your spirit from the inside out. The Lord commands us to honor our families. He commands women to be supportive, submissive pillars of the household, not agents of financial destruction. DeAndre is a hardworking man of God trying to build a legacy for your sister. You must not let petty jealousy turn you into a thief. I stared at him, feeling a profound wave of disgust. This was the exact same hypocrisy I had choked on my entire childhood. I recalled standing in this lobby 14 years ago, clutching my full academic scholarship letter. I had worked tirelessly for that achievement. But that same Sunday, Chloe had won a minor, glitzy local beauty pageant. Reverend Davis had pulled Chloe onto the altar, praising her beauty for 20 minutes, calling her a beacon of the church. When I quietly mentioned my scholarship to him later that afternoon, he had simply patted my head and told me not to let secular education distract me from finding a good Christian husband. They praised superficial compliance and actively punished independent success. You need to make this right, Nia, Reverend Davis continued, his voice dropping to a serious, commanding register. The church elders and I are deeply concerned for your eternal soul. We cannot have this kind of toxic worldly greed polluting our community. For the grace of God, and for the restoration of your family's peace, I expect you to transfer those funds to DeAndre by tomorrow morning. If you do, we will pray for your forgiveness. If you do not, we will have no choice but to formally excommunicate you from this fellowship. Elaine sniffled loudly, looking up at me from her position on the marble floor with a triumphant, malicious glint in her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought the combined social pressure of the entire congregation and the ultimate authority of the Reverend would break my resolve. DeAndre stood up a little straighter, a smug, relieved smirk finally breaking through his terrified facade. I did not flinch. I did not yell. I did not try to defend my character to a room full of people who had already decided I was the villain. I simply smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that made Reverend Davis's heavy hand falter slightly on my shoulder. I reached into my bag and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my secured audio files and turned the volume to maximum. Reverend Davis, I said softly, my voice carrying clearly in the dead silent lobby. Before I transfer $9 million to anyone, I think the church elders might want to hear exactly where their tithes have been going. I pressed play. The pristine acoustics of the church lobby amplified the audio perfectly. Reverend Davis's unmistakable panicked baritone voice blasted from my phone's speaker. But he was not preaching, he was begging. DeAndre, you have got to help me out here, man, the recorded voice pleaded frantically. The financial committee is doing a surprise audit next week. You promised me those crypto investments would double my money by Friday. I took $300,000 straight out of the Youth Ministry Expansion Fund. If I do not put that money back before Tuesday, I am going to federal prison. You said you just closed a $9 million deal. I need my cut right now, DeAndre. I need it today, or I am bringing you down with me. I hit pause. The silence that followed was absolute terrifying and heavier than concrete. The smirk vanished from DeAndre's face, replaced by sheer horror. Chloe stopped her fake crying instantly, her mouth dropping open in genuine shock. Elaine scrambled up, eyes darting frantically as she realized the catastrophic magnitude of the exposure. I looked around the circle. The church elders' men who had just been nodding in solemn agreement with the Reverend's lecture on my dark soul were now staring at him with furious, wide-eyed disbelief. The congregation members previously whispering about my supposed greed were now murmuring loudly, their shock rapidly transforming into explosive outrage. The Youth Ministry Fund was the pride of the church, heavily funded by bake sales, car washes, and the meager savings of elderly congregants. Reverend Davis's perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He began to stammer, taking a step back, raising his hands in a desperate, futile attempt to pacify the rapidly turning crowd. Now hold on. Let us not rush to judgments, he sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead. That audio is clearly taken out of context. The devil is a liar and a deceiver. Nobody listened. An older deacon who had donated thousands to the youth fund stepped forward, his face red with fury. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the reverend's chest, demanding immediate answers. Within seconds, the immaculate marble lobby descended into absolute chaos. Congregants began shouting, demanding to see the church's financial ledgers. Several people pulled out their phones, furiously dialing numbers. The pristine, holy facade of Greater Grace Fellowship was burning to the ground right before my eyes. I slipped my phone back into my purse, completely unbothered by the shouting match erupting around me. I looked at DeAndre, who was slowly backing toward the exit, realizing his most powerful ally had just been neutralized and his own exposure was imminent. I looked at my mother, whose theatrical dominance had been entirely stripped away, leaving her standing awkwardly in the middle of a mess she could no longer control. I did not say another word to any of them. I simply turned around my heels, clicking sharply against the marble floor, and walked straight out the heavy double doors into the bright Sunday sunlight. I had the information I needed. DeAndre was not just laundering money for a cartel. He was running a massive Ponzi scheme, pulling in high-profile figures like the Reverend to float his debts. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and the final act of this tragedy was about to begin. The fallout from the church incident was immediate and remarkably aggressive. Humiliated in front of their entire social circle, my family decided to go completely nuclear. By Tuesday morning, my attorney David was standing in my office with a grim expression and a thick stack of court documents. DeAndre had somehow managed to find a sleazy lawyer willing to file an emergency injunction against me in civil court. The legal filings were an absolute work of fiction. In the sworn affidavits, DeAndre officially claimed that I was mentally unstable, suffering from a severe psychological break, and actively attempting to embezzle. He explicitly stated I stole $9 million from his legitimate corporate holdings. Because my mother had fraudulently provided my name to be listed on his shell company documents as the financial guarantor, the judge had temporarily frozen my company primary operating accounts, pending a full evidentiary hearing. DeAndre thought he had finally cornered me. By freezing my business assets, he assumed he was cutting off my oxygen entirely. He truly believed this aggressive tactic would force me to negotiate the release of the $9 million sitting safely inside my private trust account, just to keep my operations alive. It was a classic desperation move, executed by a man who fundamentally misunderstood who he was dealing with. What he failed to comprehend was that my firm operated with multiple layers of financial redundancy. A temporary hold on one account was nothing more than a minor administrative annoyance to me. I simply instructed my finance team to reroute all incoming client retainers and outgoing payroll through our secondary vendor accounts. I assured my entire staff that business would continue exactly as usual and instructed building security to remain on high alert. The legal filing was entirely reckless and extremely stupid. It was a massive overreach that would ultimately provide David with even more concrete evidence of DeAndre committing perjury and showing malicious intent during the discovery phase. I left the office right at sunset, feeling a strange sense of detached anticipation. The trap my father had set was working perfectly. DeAndre was blindly thrashing around inside the net, entangling himself further with every single lie he documented in civil court. I drove my Porsche back to my luxury high-rise condominium in the heart of the city, looking forward to a quiet evening and a large glass of expensive wine. But peace was never a realistic option when dealing with the relentless entitlement of my toxic family. As I pulled into the private gated resident parking garage beneath my building, I noticed a large battered moving truck, parked illegally across two spaces in the designated loading zone. The back door of the massive vehicle was rolled all the way up, exposing several mismatched cardboard boxes, a cheap floral sofa, and a stack of faded vintage suitcases I immediately recognized. My pulse quickened not out of any genuine fear, but out of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. I parked my car very quickly. I walked through the sliding glass doors into the expansive marble lobby of my building. Sitting on a tufted velvet bench right next to the concierge desk, looking entirely too smug for a woman whose reputation had just burned to the ground less than 48 hours ago, was my mother. Elaine stood up the very moment she saw me walk through the doors, aggressively smoothing down her tailored skirt. She did not look embarrassed about the catastrophic church fiasco. In her deeply twisted mind, she had already completely rewritten the narrative to make herself the ultimate helpless victim today. I walked directly toward the private elevators, fully intending to ignore her presence entirely, but she stepped aggressively right into my path, physically blocking my way to the call button. "Hello there, Nia," she said loudly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "I brought the very first load of my personal things. I am moving in tonight." I stopped walking. Staring at her as if she had just grown a second head. I asked her exactly what she was talking about, keeping my voice incredibly low and dangerously calm so the concierge would not interrupt. Elaine smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression that reached all the way to her eyes. "DeAndre and his new lawyer explained everything to us this afternoon," she announced, projecting her voice to ensure the front desk concierge could hear every single word. "We know your business accounts are officially frozen. We know you are currently under a massive federal investigation for corporate theft and wire fraud. Once you are formally arrested and sent to a federal penitentiary for stealing from your own family, you will obviously default on this incredibly expensive lease very quickly. I am simply moving in right now. I need to secure the property and legally take over the monthly payments before the building management has a chance to evict you permanently. It is the only practical thing to do." I looked at her, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of her delusion. She actually believed the absolute nonsense DeAndre was feeding her. She honestly thought I was on the verge of losing everything I had built, and instead of offering any maternal support, she had rented a moving truck to eagerly scavenge the remains of my life. But she was not quite finished with her grand performance. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and dramatically produced a crumpled piece of lined notebook paper. "And just in case you think you can use that $9 million to pay for a high-priced criminal defense lawyer, you should know I found this hidden inside a book in the basement yesterday," she declared, waving the flimsy paper aggressively in front of my face. "It is a handwritten will from Reginald, a much newer one that completely supersedes your silly trust fund documents. He explicitly wrote it right before he died." Elaine stepped closer, thrusting the paper toward me. "He explicitly wrote that he realized his terrible past mistakes and meant to leave all of his money to Chloe because she was always the beautiful, obedient, loving daughter he never actually had. His shady estate lawyer must have hidden it from the courts to help you, but DeAndre and I are submitting it directly to the probate judge first thing tomorrow morning. Your little trust fund payout is going to be reversed by the end of the week, Nia. You are going to be left with absolutely nothing." I did not reach out to take the paper from her. I did not need to examine the document to know it was a spectacularly bad forgery. Reginald had been a highly meticulous forensic accountant who communicated exclusively through legally binding notarized trust documents, not random scribbles on torn notebook paper. The handwriting was undoubtedly Chloe's, complete with her signature looping vowels. I did not argue with her, I did not yell, and I certainly did not try to explain the biometric security measures of a federal trust to a woman who had spent her entire adult life running from reality. I just looked at my mother with pure, overwhelming pity. Her extreme narcissism had finally completely detached her from the real world. She was standing in the busy lobby of my building, waving a forged document that would legally constitute felony perjury the second she handed it to any judge, entirely convinced she was the smartest person in the room. "You are absolutely pathetic, Mother," I said softly, my voice devoid of any anger whatsoever. "Go ahead and submit that piece of paper to a federal probate judge tomorrow morning. I highly encourage you to do exactly that. Let me know how the magistrate responds to a fraudulent scribbled will." Before she could formulate a screeching response, I smoothly sidestepped her, swiped my encrypted key fob against the security panel, and stepped into the open elevator car. Elaine lunged forward to stop the doors from closing, but she was entirely too slow. The heavy metal doors slid shut completely, cutting off her angry shouts. I leaned back against the mirrored wall of the elevator as it shot upward toward my penthouse suite, exhaling a long, slow breath. The sheer stupidity of their legal strategy was almost laughable, but it perfectly reinforced my earlier suspicion. They were moving incredibly fast today. They were making catastrophic, unforced errors because they were terrified of something much bigger than me. I walked down the quiet hallway and unlocked my front door, tossing my keys onto the marble console table. My cell phone began vibrating violently inside my purse. The caller ID flashed the name of my private investigator, Julian. I answered immediately. Julian did not waste time with greetings. He told me he discovered exactly why DeAndre was so completely desperate for $9 million. My computer chimed with an incoming email. He sent a secured file. I opened it and gasped out loud. The secured file from Julian contained over 200 pages of heavily encrypted financial logs, intercepted offshore bank emails, and translated communications from a secure server based in the Cayman Islands. As I scrolled through the dense blocks of financial data, the horrifying reality of DeAndre's fake empire finally crystallized right in front of my eyes. DeAndre was not a cryptocurrency genius. He was not an innovative entrepreneur, and he was certainly not the mastermind behind a legitimate $9 million real estate investment firm. He was a low-level middleman, a disposable financial mule who had somehow managed to entangle himself with a highly sophisticated, incredibly ruthless money laundering syndicate operating out of Eastern Europe. The documents painted a crystal-clear picture of absolute financial devastation and gross incompetence. 9 months ago, the syndicate had entrusted DeAndre with exactly $9 million in untraceable digital assets. His singular job was to wash the funds through his network of fraudulent Georgia shell companies, create fake consulting invoices, and return the clean money to their offshore accounts. But DeAndre, driven by his insatiable ego and profound stupidity, decided to play God with money that did not belong to him. Instead of laundering the cash quietly as instructed, he illegally diverted the entire $9 million into highly volatile speculative cryptocurrency trades. He genuinely believed he could double the money overnight, pay back the syndicate, and pocket the massive profits to buy his dream mansion in Buckhead. The market crashed violently 3 weeks later, wiping out his portfolio. DeAndre lost every single penny of the syndicate's money. The intercepted emails attached to Julian's report were not polite inquiries about a missed payment or a delayed wire transfer. They were explicit graphic death threats. The syndicate did not care about market volatility, bad trades, or DeAndre's pathetic excuses. They gave him a hard, uncompromising deadline, this upcoming Friday at midnight. If the $9 million was not returned in full by that exact moment, the syndicate promised to send a specialized collection team to Atlanta. The instructions detailed in the translation were chillingly precise. They were not just going to kill DeAndre. They were going to brutally execute Chloe and anyone else living in their household, to send a terrifying message to their other financial mules across the country. This was the dark, undeniable truth behind his desperate Sunday dinner announcement. When the Reginald Sterling Trust attempted to wire my inheritance to the account connected to my stolen Social Security number, DeAndre saw his absolute final lifeline. He thought he could steal my $9 million to pay off the mob entirely willing to let me take the fall for his massive federal crimes just to save his own skin. He had weaponized my identity not just out of greed but out of sheer primal terror. I sat in the quiet glow of my computer monitor, the weight of the revelation pressing down heavily on my shoulders. It was currently Tuesday night. DeAndre had exactly 3 days left to live. The civil lawsuit he filed against me that morning, claiming I was mentally unstable and freezing my business accounts, was his absolute last, pathetic attempt to force my hand before the collection team arrived. I closed the file and leaned back in my leather chair, listening to the gentle hum of the city traffic far below my penthouse window. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. I felt a profound, chilling sense of validation. My mother had thrown my entire life away to protect and elevate a man who had literally put a price tag on her golden child's head. The empire of lies was rapidly burning to the ground, and I was the only person holding a fire extinguisher. Suddenly, the sharp, piercing chime of my front doorbell shattered the absolute silence of my apartment. I glanced at the digital clock sitting on my desk. It was exactly midnight. Nobody gets past the heavily guarded front desk of my building at this hour without authorization unless they sneak into the elevator bank closely behind another resident. I stood up, walked softly towards the front foyer, and tapped the security screen mounted on the wall to activate the exterior hallway camera. The high-definition video feed flickered to life. I stared at the glowing screen, genuinely taken aback by the pathetic sight unfolding right outside my door. It was Chloe and my mother, Elaine. But the smug arrogance they had proudly displayed in the lobby just a few hours earlier was completely gone. They looked absolutely destroyed. Chloe was standing barefoot on the cold tile, her expensive designer dress torn at the hem, her makeup running down her face in thick, dark streaks. Elaine was trembling violently, clutching her leather purse to her chest, as if it were a life preserver. They were literally kneeling on my welcome mat, frantically pressing the doorbell over and over again, completely disregarding the fact that they were likely waking up my wealthy neighbors. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open. Chloe practically collapsed forward into my foyer, sobbing with such intense gasping breaths that she could barely form a coherent word. Elaine dropped to her knees right beside her, tears streaming down her face, entirely stripped of her usual theatrical poise and commanding presence. This was not a calculated performance designed to manipulate the church elders. This was raw, unfiltered, paralyzing fear. "Nia, you have to help us!" Chloe choked out, grabbing desperately at the hem of my silk pajamas with shaking hands. "Please, you have to save us. They are going to kill him. They are going to kill all of us." I looked down at my sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. The dynamic playing out on my hardwood floor was a deeply twisted, high-stakes repetition of our entire childhood. Chloe had spent her whole life pushing me down, mocking my appearance, and laughing maliciously, while my mother belittled my academic achievements. But the very second she faced a consequence she could not cry her way out of, she always came crawling to my bedroom door to demand salvation. When she failed her high school algebra class and faced losing her coveted spot on the cheerleading squad, she begged me to hack into the school portal and change her grades. When she wrecked her first car while driving under the influence of alcohol, she called me sobbing at 2 in the morning, begging me to take the blame so she would not go to jail. "You always fix things, Nia. Fix." Chloe pleaded loudly, her voice echoing in the quiet, expansive hallway. "You are the smart one. You are the only one who knows how to handle things like this." DeAndre told us everything tonight. He owes incredibly dangerous people money and they gave him until Friday. If you just give him the $9 million from the trust, we can pay them off and disappear completely. Please, Nia. I am your sister. You cannot just let me die. Elaine reached out, her hands visibly shaking as she tried to grasp my arm. I stepped back smoothly, avoiding her physical touch completely. "Nia, please," Elaine wept, her voice cracking with a desperate agony I had never heard from her before. "I know I have not been the perfect mother to you. I know I have made terrible mistakes and treated you unfairly, but you cannot be this cruel. You have the money sitting right there safely in your account. You can save your sister's life tonight. I will do whatever you want. I will leave you alone forever and never ask you for another dime. Just write the check, please. I implore you, as your mother, show us some mercy." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the two women who had spent over 3 decades systematically trying to destroy my self-worth and drain my resources. They were not apologizing for the decades of emotional abuse. They were not apologizing for stealing 20 years of letters and financial support from my biological father. They were not even apologizing for stealing my social security number to facilitate a massive federal crime. They were just begging for a bailout because their fraudulent house of cards had finally collapsed and caught fire with them trapped inside. They still viewed me as nothing more than a highly competent servant, a designated problem solver whose only real purpose was to absorb their pain and pay their massive debts. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute silence of the room stretch out until their sobbing quieted down into terrified whimpers. I looked directly into Chloe's bloodshot, pleading eyes and then shifted my gaze to Elaine's tear-stained, desperate face. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell scream or try to explain the complex federal trap my father had successfully built from beyond the grave. Emotion is a luxury for people who have not spent their entire lives surviving in a psychological war zone. I kept my voice perfectly flat, delivering my final verdict with the clinical precision of a surgeon severing a dead limb. "You stood in the lobby of this very building just a few hours ago," I said coldly, my words slicing through the heavy, tense air. "You waved a forged will in my face and smiled. You filed a civil lawsuit against me yesterday and explicitly tried to take my company, my professional reputation, and my freedom. You actively tried to send me to a federal prison to cover up a cartel debt that you created." I paused, letting the crushing weight of their own malicious actions settle heavily onto their shoulders as the realization of my refusal finally hit them. The answer is no. I stepped back inside my apartment and smoothly pushed the heavy wooden door forward. Chloe screamed my name, a primal, terrified sound that echoed down the long corridor, but I did not hesitate. I shut the door firmly in their faces. The heavy thud of the deadbolt sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I walked back to my bedroom, leaving my mother and sister weeping in the hallway, until building security finally escorted them off the premises. Wednesday and Thursday passed in a tense, suspended silence. I went to work, directed my team, and finalized the forensic documentation with my attorney, David. DeAndre had exactly 48 hours before the offshore syndicate made good on their lethal promise. I honestly expected them to pack their bags and flee the country. I expected them to drain whatever meager savings they had left and run for the border like the cowards they truly were. But I had severely underestimated their addiction to public image and their profound detachment from reality. Instead of running, DeAndre and Chloe decided to throw a massive party. It was not just any party. It was a lavish, ridiculously expensive 10-year anniversary vow renewal ceremony scheduled for Friday night at the St. Regis, one of the most exclusive five-star hotels in downtown Atlanta. The sheer absurdity of the situation was almost difficult to comprehend. They were marked for death by an Eastern European money laundering syndicate, yet they were busy picking out floral arrangements and hiring a live jazz band. But as my private investigator Julian quickly explained over a secure phone call, the party was not a celebration. It was a desperate, highly calculated stalling tactic. The syndicate had sent watchdogs to Atlanta to collect the $9 million in person. DeAndre threw the extravagant event to create a highly public spectacle, a luxurious facade designed to convince the cartel enforcers that his massive investment deal was real and that the payout was imminent. He needed a crowded, high-profile venue to keep the enforcers from simply dragging him out of his apartment and executing him in an alleyway. The entire ballroom was a hostage situation dressed up in silk and champagne, and DeAndre needed me to be the ransom. I found out exactly how they planned to force my compliance on Thursday afternoon. My phone buzzed with a lengthy, frantic text message from my mother, Elaine. It was not a plea for mercy like the one she had delivered on my welcome mat. It was a direct, vicious threat. The message was explicitly clear. "Nia, you will attend the anniversary gala tomorrow night at 8 o'clock sharp," she wrote. "You will bring a certified bank check for the $9 million and hand it directly to DeAndre during the toast. If you refuse to show up or if you come empty-handed, DeAndre has already prepared a massive media leak. He has heavily doctored financial documents that implicate your public relations firm in a massive embezzlement scandal with your top-tier celebrity clients. He has the emails scheduled to send to every major news outlet and gossip blog in the country at midnight. Your reputation will be completely destroyed. Your life's work will be over. You have no choice." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the blackmail attempt over and over again. Elaine actually thought she held a winning hand. She thought the threat of a fabricated public relations crisis would terrify a woman who literally dismantled public relations crises for a living. They were threatening to burn down my entire career, the empire I had built with my own two hands, all to cover the tracks of a thief. It was the ultimate insult, the final undeniable proof that they viewed me as nothing more than collateral damage in their endless pursuit of unearned luxury. I did not reply to the text message. I did not block the number. I simply forwarded the entire threat to my attorney to add to the mounting pile of federal extortion charges we were preparing to hand over to the authorities. They wanted a show. They wanted a grand public spectacle to save their pathetic lives. I decided I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but I was going to rewrite the ending to suit my own narrative. Friday evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity that hung over the city. I did not dress like a victim being marched to the slaughter. I dressed like an executioner. I pulled a stunning, custom-tailored emerald green silk gown from my closet. The deep, rich color contrasted sharply against my skin, the cut elegant, powerful, and utterly uncompromising. I applied my makeup with meticulous precision, my hands completely steady. I swept my hair up into a sharp, sophisticated style that highlighted the severe angle of my jawline. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was not the scared, unwanted daughter from Fairfield. She was a self-made millionaire, a master strategist, and a survivor who was finally ready to cut the toxic rot out of her life permanently. I grabbed my designer clutch from the vanity. I did not pack a checkbook. I did not bring any banking information. I packed a single heavily encrypted matte black flash drive. It contained the entire forensic audit, the cartel emails, the forged state documents, and the audio recording of the corrupt church reverend. It was the digital equivalent of a nuclear bomb. I drove my Porsche to the St. Regis, handing the keys to the valet with a crisp $100 bill. The grand lobby of the hotel was dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering arrangements of white roses. I walked toward the grand ballroom, the muffled sound of a jazz quartet filtering through the heavy oak doors. I pushed the doors open and stepped inside, instantly enveloped by the clinking of champagne flutes and the low murmur of wealthy Atlanta socialites. The room was packed with hundreds of guests, all dressed in their finest evening wear, completely oblivious to the fact that they were attending a high-stakes standoff between a fraudster and a deadly criminal syndicate. Chloe had spared absolutely no expense. There were ice sculptures, a massive multi-tiered wedding cake, and professional photographers circling the dance floor. It was a nauseating display of stolen wealth and desperate posturing. My eyes immediately scanned the crowd, cutting through the fake smiles and the glittering jewelry. I spotted Chloe first. She was wearing a massive, heavily beaded white gown that looked more like a wedding dress than an anniversary outfit. She was laughing loudly, clutching a glass of champagne, but her eyes were wide and frantic, darting nervously around the room. Elaine was standing right next to her, wearing a stiff silver dress, aggressively working the room and pretending everything was perfectly normal. Then I found DeAndre. He was standing near the front of the stage, sweating profusely through his expensive tuxedo. He was gripping a microphone with white knuckles, constantly wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner slowly climb the wooden stairs. I followed DeAndre's terrified gaze toward the back of the room. Standing perfectly still near the mahogany bar, entirely separated from the joyful celebration, were three men. They wore sharp, impeccably tailored dark suits. They were not drinking. They were not talking. They were just watching DeAndre with cold, dead eyes. They radiated a dark, menacing energy that completely, fundamentally shifted the atmosphere in their immediate vicinity. These were the cartel watchdogs Julian had warned me about. They had come to collect their $9 million, and they were not going to leave the hotel without it. The deadline was rapidly approaching, and the tension radiating from DeAndre was almost visible in the air. He was a trapped animal, desperate for any possible way out of the cage he had locked himself inside. I took a slow, deliberate step into the center of the room. The emerald green of my gown caught the light, and heads began to turn in my direction. The low hum of conversation slowly died down as guests noticed my arrival. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. I walked forward, the heels of my shoes clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. I did not look at the cartel men. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I kept my eyes locked entirely on DeAndre. The moment he saw me walking through the crowd, a look of profound, overwhelming relief washed over his sweaty face. He actually believed his pathetic blackmail attempt had worked. He thought I was walking toward him carrying his salvation in my clutch. DeAndre did not wait for me to reach the front of the room. He was too desperate, too eager to prove to the menacing men at the bar that he had secured their money. He raised the microphone to his mouth, his voice booming over the speakers and echoing loudly across the massive ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could please have your attention," he announced, a hysterical edge creeping into his forced, jovial tone. The jazz band stopped playing abruptly. The entire room fell completely silent, every single eye turning toward the stage. "I am so incredibly honored to welcome a very special guest tonight," DeAndre continued, gesturing wildly in my direction with his free hand. "Please give a warm, massive round of applause for my beautiful, brilliant sister-in-law, Nia. She has just arrived, and she has brought the $9 million check to officially close our massive corporate investment deal." The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. Wealthy guests smiled and clapped, entirely ignorant of the dark, twisted reality hidden just beneath the surface of the grand announcement. Chloe let out a loud, theatrical sob of relief, pressing her hands to her chest. Elaine beamed with malicious pride, believing she had finally broken my spirit and bent me to her absolute will. The three men in suits at the back of the room subtly shifted their weight, their cold eyes moving from DeAndre to me, waiting to see the massive sum of money materialize. DeAndre stood at the edge of the stage, extending his hand toward me with a desperate, greedy smile. The trap was fully set, the audience was completely captivated, and the moment of absolute destruction had finally arrived. I did not hesitate for a single second. I gripped my designer clutch tightly, maintaining my icy, confident smile, and stepped up onto the stage. The wooden floorboards of the stage creaked slightly under my heels as I reached the center spotlight. DeAndre practically shoved the microphone into my hand, his palms slick with nervous sweat. He stood there panting heavily, his eyes silently begging me to produce the $9 million check and save his miserable life. I looked out over the sea of expectant faces. Hundreds of Atlanta's most elite socialites, business moguls, and wealthy influencers were staring back at me, their crystal champagne flutes paused mid-air, waiting for the grand financial finale they had been promised. I did not reach into my designer clutch. Instead, I gave a subtle, practiced nod to the audio-visual technician standing in the shadows at the back of the room. I had visited this exact hotel ballroom earlier that afternoon, walking through the empty space to visualize the perfect angle for the projector. I had handed the head technician a crisp stack of $100 bills to ensure my specific instructions were followed to the letter, bypassing the hotel's standard operating procedures. He knew exactly what to do when I gave the signal. He gave me a quick thumbs up in return and plugged my encrypted black flash drive directly into the master projection system. Instantly, the soft, ambient lighting in the ballroom dimmed to pitch black. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the massive crowd. Behind me, a massive cinema-sized projection screen slowly began to descend from the ceiling, the mechanical hum of its motor cutting through the sudden silence. DeAndre turned around, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you doing, Nia?" he whispered frantically, stepping closer to me. "Where is the money? Just give me the check so we can finish this." I ignored him completely. I raised the microphone to my lips, my voice projecting clearly and powerfully through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. "Thank you all so much for gathering here tonight to celebrate this monumental occasion," I announced smoothly, my tone dripping with a dark, calculated irony. DeAndre and Chloe wanted to share the absolute truth behind their incredible success and their massive new investment deal. So I brought the receipts. The projector flared to life with a blinding white light. The first document flashed onto the massive screen, magnified to 20 feet tall, so that every single person in the room could easily read the fine print. It was a scanned copy of a certified bank statement from the Reginald Sterling Trust, dated 15 years ago. Right next to it was a highly magnified image of a cashed child support check, clearly endorsed by my mother, Elaine. I clicked the small remote hidden in the palm of my hand, and the slides began to transition in rapid succession. Check after check, year after year, the undeniable proof of her pathological greed washed over the audience. The screen displayed decades of stolen funds, explicitly highlighting the exact routing numbers and forged deposit slips, showing how Elaine had intercepted the money my biological father had sent for my care. She had illegally funneled thousands of dollars every single month directly into Chloe's private school tuition accounts, lavish country club memberships, and her own exorbitant luxury credit card payments. The crowd gasped loudly. The sound of hundreds of people simultaneously sucking in their breath echoed like a physical wave crashing against the heavily draped walls of the ballroom. A wealthy woman standing near the front row actually dropped her crystal champagne flute, the glass shattering sharply against the hardwood floor, but nobody even looked down at the mess. Businessmen pointed at the screen, their eyes wide with disbelief, whispering frantically to their wives. This was not a petty rumor whispered in a country club bathroom. This was irrefutable documentary evidence of a mother robbing her own child blind to finance a golden facade. I looked down at Elaine. She was standing frozen in the middle of the dance floor, her face completely drained of color. The silver fabric of her expensive dress seemed to lose its shine as the sheer magnitude of her public exposure paralyzed her completely. The people she had spent years desperately trying to impress were now staring at her with undisguised disgust. But I was not even close to being finished. I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted away from the stolen child support checks and displayed the highly confidential state corporate filings I had uncovered earlier that week. The massive letters of DeAndre's fraudulent shell companies loomed over the crowd. Apex Horizon Ventures, Quantum Crypto Solutions. I had highlighted the guarantor signature section in bright neon yellow marker so nobody could possibly miss the federal crime staring back at them. It was my forged signature right next to my stolen social security number and my private residential address. The $9 million investment deal DeAndre has been bragging about tonight does not exist, I declared into the microphone, my voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers with absolute clarity. He is not a cryptocurrency genius. He is a desperate fraud who stole my legal identity to set up illegal shell companies entirely with the active, willing help of my mother. He attempted to use my pristine credit score and my spotless financial history as a human shield to hide his catastrophic financial failures from some very dangerous people. The ballroom erupted. The polite, refined atmosphere instantly shattered into a chaotic uproar of shouting and outraged murmurs. The elite crowd suddenly realized they were not attending a lavish anniversary party. They were witnessing the spectacular real-time implosion of a massive criminal enterprise. The facade of the perfect wealthy family was entirely destroyed, replaced by the ugly, undeniable truth of their relentless greed. DeAndre finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock as the sheer gravity of his public ruin settled over him. The realization that he was not getting the money and that his federal crimes were now being broadcast to hundreds of powerful witnesses triggered a violent animalistic panic. "Turn that off right now," he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking hysterically into the microphone he had dropped on the floor. He lunged wildly across the stage toward me, his hands reaching out to grab the microphone from my grip. "You crazy bitch, you are killing us. You are literally signing my death warrant right now." I easily stepped backward, my emerald gown flowing gracefully around my ankles, entirely avoiding his frantic, uncoordinated grasp. The two massive private security guards I had quietly retained for the evening immediately stepped out from behind the heavy velvet stage curtains. They moved with professional speed, stepping firmly between DeAndre and myself, blocking him from coming any closer to me. Down on the floor, Chloe lost her mind entirely. She began shrieking uncontrollably, the high-pitched sound cutting sharply through the noise of the angry crowd. She hiked up the heavy skirt of her white beaded gown and scrambled clumsily toward the audio-visual booth, desperately trying to find a cord to unplug the projector. She looked completely unhinged, her expensive makeup smeared across her cheeks, her carefully constructed image of the perfect society wife shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Seeing both her golden child and her fraudulent son-in-law completely melting down in front of Atlanta's high society, Elaine decided to play her absolute last pathetic card. She clutched her chest with both hands, let out a loud theatrical groan of agony, and dramatically collapsed into a nearby tufted velvet chair. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut and began gasping for air, pretending to suffer a massive life-threatening heart attack right in the middle of the ballroom. In the past, this exact manipulative performance would have commanded the immediate sympathetic attention of the entire room. People would have rushed to her side offering glasses of water, fanning her face, and frantically calling for ambulances. But tonight absolutely nobody moved to help her. The wealthy guests simply stepped away from her in unison, forming a wide, empty circle of absolute judgment around her chair. They had just seen the undeniable proof of her pathological lies projected 20 feet high. Her theatrical medical emergency was met with nothing but cold, silent contempt. I stood tall in the center of the stage, completely untouched by the absolute chaos raging around me. I looked down at the pathetic ruins of my toxic family. DeAndre was being restrained by my security, sweating profusely and swearing loudly. Chloe was sobbing on the floor near the equipment rack. Elaine was peeking through her eyelids, realizing her fake heart attack had failed miserably. I raised the microphone one final time, making sure my voice carried over the din of the panicked crowd. My tone was calm, steady, and filled with a cold, absolute authority. For 32 years, this toxic family called me worthless, I said, staring directly down into my mother's supposedly unconscious face. You treated me like a burden from the day I was born. You treated me like a designated scapegoat whose only purpose was to absorb your failures. But the entire time you were tearing my self-esteem down, you were secretly surviving off my pristine credit, my biological father's stolen money, and my exhausting sanity. You built your entire fake, luxurious existence by bleeding me completely dry while telling me I was the one dragging you down. But tonight the free ride ends permanently. You wanted a grand public spectacle to save your pathetic lives. Now you have one. You are finally going to face the brutal consequences of your own criminal actions, and I am not going to clean up your mess ever again. As the final word left my lips, a sudden terrifying shift occurred at the back of the grand ballroom. The three menacing men in dark tailored suits, the cartel watchdogs who had been standing silently by the mahogany bar all night, finally began to move. They did not run. They did not shout or draw attention to themselves. They moved with a synchronized, chilling purpose, cutting a straight, unyielding path directly through the center of the crowd. The wealthy guests instinctively scrambled out of their way, pressing themselves against the dinner tables, sensing the dangerous, lethal energy radiating from the three silent men. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy, thick with the undeniable promise of impending violence. The jazz band remained completely silent on their risers. Even the outraged murmuring of the socialites faded into a terrified, breathless hush. As the men advanced steadily down the center aisle, their eyes locked entirely on the stage. DeAndre completely stopped struggling against the firm grip of my security guards. He slowly turned his head and saw the three enforcers walking steadily toward the stage. All the remaining color instantly vanished from his sweaty face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked like a literal ghost. The aggressive, arrogant criminal who had boldly stolen my identity mocked my career and threatened to destroy my public relations firm just 24 hours ago, suddenly completely vanished. He was instantly replaced by a broken, terrified little boy facing the absolute, inescapable end of the line. DeAndre let out a strangled, breathless sob that echoed horribly through the silent ballroom. His legs gave out. His knees completely buckled beneath his weight. He collapsed heavily onto the hard wooden floorboards of the stage, ignoring the security guards, who were still loosely holding his arms. He began to cry thick, heavy tears of pure, unadulterated terror, streaming rapidly down his face as he stared blankly at the approaching men. His chest heaved with violent, hyperventilating gasps. He truly believed the cartel enforcers were about to drag him off the stage by his hair and execute him right there in front of the entire terrified assembly of Atlanta's elite. He had played his final desperate card. He had officially lost the $9 million, and now the Grim Reaper was walking directly toward him in a tailored suit. DeAndre squeezed his eyes shut and curled into a tight, trembling ball on the wooden stage floor. He wrapped his arms around his head, waiting for the cold steel of a suppressed pistol to press against his temple. He braced for the blinding flash of pain, fully expecting his life to end right there before the horrified elite. The measured footsteps of the three men echoed loudly as they reached the edge of the stage. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, wrapped in thick, suffocating silence. But the deafening gunshot never came. Instead, the lead man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with piercing blue eyes, bypassed DeAndre entirely. He stepped onto the stage and walked directly toward me. Reaching inside the pocket of his dark suit jacket, he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a worn leather wallet and flipped it open with a sharp, authoritative snap, holding it high so the overhead spotlights hit it perfectly. A heavy gold shield gleamed brilliantly under the lights. Federal Bureau of Investigation, the man announced, his deep voice carrying easily without the need for a microphone. Financial Crimes Division. I am Special Agent Thomas Vance. The collective gasp ripping through the ballroom was not born of shock over family drama. It was the unmistakable sound of absolute legal terror. The wealthy guests suddenly realized they were standing in the center of a massive federal sting operation. DeAndre slowly peeled his trembling arms away from his head. He stared blankly at the shining gold badge, his brain failing to process the sudden shift in reality. The men standing over him were not syndicate enforcers sent to execute him. They were federal agents. I looked down at DeAndre's pathetic, tear-stained face, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. I raised the microphone back to my lips, deciding to grant him the absolute clarity he desperately needed before he was hauled away. You really thought you were a mastermind, DeAndre? I said, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings with icy precision. You thought you were outsmarting the banking system, outsmarting me, and outsmarting the trust fund of a man you arrogantly dismissed as a deadbeat. But you never actually knew who Reginald Sterling really was. My biological father was not just a highly successful forensic accountant working in the private sector. He was one of the most prolific, highly valued confidential informants the Federal Bureau of Investigation had ever recruited. I paused, letting the crushing weight of that revelation settle over the silent crowd. I watched Chloe cover her mouth with her trembling hands, her eyes wide with mounting horror as she realized the inescapable trap they had walked into. Reginald spent the last 10 years of his life dismantling massive corporate fraud rings and offshore money laundering operations from the inside out. I continued, ensuring every single word pierced through DeAndre's shock. He tracked the exact same illicit financial networks that you foolishly decided to play games with. When my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer last year, he did not just want to leave me a simple financial inheritance. He wanted to ensure that the toxic parasites feeding off my mother's boundless greed would never be able to touch me or the empire he worked so hard to build. He knew you were laundering cash for a ruthless syndicate, DeAndre. He tracked your sloppy digital footprint long before you even registered your very first fraudulent shell company in the state of Georgia. So my father worked directly with Agent Vance to set the ultimate inescapable trap. That $9 million that miraculously landed in my private bank account on Tuesday morning at exactly 7 o'clock was not just a standard trust fund payout. It was heavily monitored, federally marked bait money. DeAndre let out a weak, strangled gasp, his face turning the color of wet ash. The realization was finally beginning to penetrate his thick skull. Every single dollar of that massive wire transfer was digitally tagged and completely traced by the United States government, I explained, looking down at him with undisguised contempt. The FBI already knew about the syndicate, and they needed to build a watertight, undeniable case against your entire local laundering network. But they needed you to take the bait voluntarily. They needed you to legally claim the illicit funds as your own to prove your direct involvement in the conspiracy. And exactly like a greedy, desperate amateur, you walked right into the snare without a single second of hesitation. You did exactly what my father predicted you would do. When the advanced biometric security protocols intercepted your clumsy, amateurish hacking attempt and rerouted the funds safely to my secure account. You panicked. You knew the syndicate was breathing down your neck demanding their lost money by tonight. So you escalated your criminal activity to a level of sheer stupidity that practically handed the federal government a wrapped conviction on a silver platter. I gestured toward the massive projection screen still glowing brightly behind me, the forged state documents looming over the terrified crowd. You actually went to a civil courthouse on Tuesday morning and filed an emergency injunction against me. I said, my tone laced with biting mockery. You swore under penalty of perjury on the public record that the $9 million sitting in my account was your legitimate corporate funding. You explicitly claimed legal ownership of the federally marked bait money. By formally filing those legal documents and signing your name to the sworn affidavits, you formally confessed to massive federal wire fraud, attempted embezzlement, and severe identity theft. You literally provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation with a legally binding notarized confession. And if that was not quite enough to seal your ultimate fate, you also forged my signature on the state corporate documents to create your fake shell companies, completely tying your illegal operations directly to the bait money. You thought you were freezing my business assets to force my hand, but in reality you were just enthusiastically tightening the federal noose around your own neck. DeAndre stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish pulled from the ocean. The absolute magnitude of his disastrous mistakes finally crushed whatever tiny shred of arrogance he had left. He had not just failed to pay back a deadly cartel, he had actively, aggressively demanded the federal government hand him marked evidence in a massive financial crimes investigation. He had spent the entire week digging his own grave, completely convinced he was building a luxury mansion. The irony was so profound, it was almost poetic. Special Agent Vance did not give DeAndre any more time to process his total irreversible destruction. He gestured sharply to his two stoic partners standing behind him. The agent stepped forward immediately, grabbing DeAndre roughly by the shoulders of his expensive tuxedo and hauling him forcibly to his feet. DeAndre's legs were completely useless, his tailored pants heavily wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He hung between the two large federal agents like a broken, pathetic rag doll, his chin resting weakly on his chest. One of the agents violently wrenched DeAndre's arms behind his back, the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs, locking securely into place, echoed clearly over the stunned, breathless silence of the ballroom. DeAndre let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail as the cold metal bit deeply into his wrists, the sound reminding me of a terrified child rather than a hardened crypto entrepreneur. "You have the right to remain silent." Agent Vance recited, his voice completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy as he read the mandatory Miranda warning. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you completely understand these fundamental rights exactly as I have read them to you right now?" DeAndre did not answer. He just kept sobbing loudly, his heavy tears dripping continuously onto the pristine hardwood floor of the stage, creating small dark puddles near my designer heels. He was completely broken, his entire fraudulent empire shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the span of 10 minutes. But as the federal agents began to turn him around to drag him toward the side exit, Agent Vance suddenly stopped. He turned his imposing frame away from the shattered crying man. He looked down into the expansive crowd, his sharp blue eyes scanning the horrified faces of the wealthy elite until he found exactly who he was looking for. The FBI was not just here to arrest the foolish, expendable middleman. The brilliant, meticulously calculated trap that my late father Reginald Sterling had designed from beyond the grave was far more comprehensive than just capturing him. And to the absolute horror of my family, they were not just taking DeAndre alone tonight. Agent Vance did not put his gold badge away. Instead, he pivoted sharply on his heel, turning his imposing frame away from the blubbering, broken mess that was DeAndre. He looked directly at Chloe, who was still kneeling on the hardwood stage near the audio-visual equipment, her face pale and her hands trembling violently. Agent Vance signaled to a female agent standing near the stage stairs. She stepped forward, smoothly pulling a thickly folded stack of crisp white legal documents from the interior pocket of her dark suit jacket. Chloe stared at the approaching agent, her eyes darting frantically around the ballroom, as if hoping one of her wealthy socialite friends would suddenly jump up and intervene. But nobody moved a single muscle. The elite crowd remained absolutely frozen, completely captivated by the devastating reality unfolding before them. Chloe Williams, the female agent, announced, her voice cutting through the thick, terrified silence of the room. "We have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. You are officially being indicted as a primary accessory to federal money laundering conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated identity theft." Chloe gasped loudly, stumbling backward until her back hit the heavy velvet curtains. "No!" she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, unhinged wail. "No, you have the wrong person. I did not do anything wrong. I am just his wife. I do not know anything about his businesses or his corporate funding. I am completely innocent. You cannot arrest me." The female agent did not even blink at the dramatic outburst. She simply unfolded the legal documents, her expression remaining entirely stoic. "Ignorance is not a valid legal defense when your legally binding signature is permanently attached to 12 fraudulent shell companies," the agent explained calmly. "You voluntarily signed as a co-guarantor on every single limited liability company that DeAndre registered in the state of Georgia. You actively participated in opening the fraudulent corporate bank accounts used to wash illicit syndicate funds. You are just as legally responsible for this massive federal crime as your husband." The undeniable reality of her situation finally shattered Chloe's fragile, manicured facade. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire privileged life effortlessly crying her way out of every single consequence, suddenly realized that her tears held absolutely no currency with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Panic, raw and completely uncontrollable, completely took over her mind. Instead of submitting to the federal agents gracefully, Chloe made the absolute worst decision possible. She decided to run. She hiked up the heavy beaded skirt of her massive white anniversary gown, practically ripping the expensive silk fabric in her sheer desperation. She lunged off the side of the wooden stage, her high stiletto heels hitting the plush ballroom carpet with a heavy thud. She shoved violently past a wealthy male guest blindly sprinting toward the grand double doors at the back of the room. It was a pathetic, fundamentally absurd sight. A grown woman dressed like a bride clumsily fleeing from a massive federal sting operation in the middle of a 5-star luxury hotel. She did not make it more than 20 feet. The female agent moved with terrifying, highly trained speed. She sprinted across the carpet, easily catching up to Chloe's frantic, uncoordinated escape attempt. Without a single moment of hesitation, the agent lunged forward, grabbing Chloe firmly by the shoulders and tackling her violently to the ground. Chloe hit the carpet hard, the breath rushing out of her lungs in a loud, painful wheeze. The massive white gown tangled around her legs, completely trapping her. The agent expertly pinned Chloe face down against the floor, ignoring her hysterical screams and desperate thrashing. The sharp metallic click of a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs, snapping securely around Chloe's wrists, echoed through the room. "Get off of me!" Chloe sobbed wildly. Her perfectly styled hair, completely ruined her face, pressed forcefully into the hotel carpet. "Mother, please help me. Mother, do something." But Elaine was not coming to save her golden child. The moment Agent Vance had turned his attention toward Chloe and announced the federal indictment, Elaine experienced a truly miraculous medical recovery. Her theatrical, life-threatening heart attack completely vanished into thin air. She abruptly stopped, gasping for breath, her eyes snapping open wide. She realized instantly that the federal agents were systematically dismantling her entire fraudulent empire, and she was the absolute last remaining target in the room. Elaine slowly slipped out of her tufted velvet chair, keeping her head down, hoping the chaos of Chloe's violent arrest would provide the perfect distraction. She grabbed her expensive leather handbag and began inching quietly toward the heavy wooden side doors, leading directly into the hotel kitchen corridors. She was abandoning her favorite daughter without a single second of hesitation, entirely focused on saving her own skin. I saw her moving through the shadows. I stepped off the stage, my emerald green gown flowing silently behind me, and cut quickly across the perimeter of the ballroom. Just as Elaine reached out to grab the brass handle of the kitchen door, I stepped firmly into her path, completely blocking her only viable escape route. Elaine practically jumped out of her skin, letting out a sharp, terrified yelp. She clutched her leather handbag tightly to her chest, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked absolutely cornered, her carefully constructed mask of maternal superiority completely shattered. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, watching the federal agents drag a sobbing handcuffed Chloe roughly to her feet. "Nia, please," Elaine whispered frantically, her voice trembling with a pathetic, desperate urgency. "Move out of the way. Let me pass. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. I did not know DeAndre was laundering money. I swear to you I did not know anything about a criminal syndicate." I stood perfectly still, blocking the doorway with my entire body. I looked down at the woman who had brought me into this world, feeling absolutely no biological connection to her whatsoever. She was just a stranger, a cruel, selfish stranger, who had finally run out of victims to sacrifice. "You might not have known about the cartel, Mother," I replied, my voice dangerously soft and completely devoid of any sympathy. "But you absolutely knew about the federal identity theft. You actively handed DeAndre my social security number. You sat right next to him at your kitchen table while he forged my signature on those state corporate documents. You enthusiastically helped him build the exact fraudulent weapon that the federal government is now using to lock your precious daughter away for a very long time." Elaine began to weep uncontrollably, the heavy tears ruining her expensive makeup. She reached out with a shaking hand, desperately trying to grab my arm, but I smoothly stepped back, completely refusing to let her toxic energy touch me. "You always wanted Chloe to have absolutely everything I had," I said, my words slicing through the heavy air with the clinical precision of a scalpel. "You stole my father's financial support to fund her lifestyle. You demanded I pay her bills, fix her mistakes, and sacrifice my own happiness so she could continuously shine. You wanted her to mirror my success without putting in a single ounce of the actual work." I paused, letting my icy gaze lock entirely onto her terrified eyes. "Well, now she gets to share my identity theft case too. I hope she enjoys the federal indictment you helped secure for her." Elaine fell entirely to pieces. She dropped her expensive leather handbag onto the floor, completely abandoning her remaining shred of dignity. She grabbed my hands, her grip painfully tight, sinking down until she was practically kneeling on the floor in front of me. "Nia, you have to fix this," she begged loudly, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated agony. "You are a highly successful crisis manager. You have millions of dollars and elite corporate connections. Call your high-powered lawyers right now. Tell them to come down here and fix this mess. Tell them to explain that Chloe was just confused, that she made a simple mistake. I will do anything you want. I will publicly apologize. I will give you whatever you demand. Just call David and tell him to get my baby out of those handcuffs. Please, Nia. She is your sister." I looked down at her pathetic begging form. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse. I thought about the stolen letters from my biological father, hidden in a locked basement cabinet, while she told me I was completely unlovable. I thought about the civil lawsuit she happily supported just 2 days ago, entirely willing to send me to federal prison to cover their tracks. I gently pulled my hands out of her desperate grip. I reached over to a nearby catering tray, sitting on a cocktail table, and picked up a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the crisp, cold taste as it slid down my throat. "Sorry, Mom," I said simply, my voice ringing with a cold, absolute finality. "I only work for innocent clients." Innocent. Elaine let out a gut-wrenching wail of absolute despair, burying her face in her hands. But there was no time left for her to negotiate. Agent Vance stepped up right behind her, his shadow falling heavily over her kneeling form. He did not ask her to stand. He simply reached down, grabbed her firmly by the arm, and pulled her forcefully to her feet. The final pair of heavy steel handcuffs clicked securely around Elaine's wrists, officially linking her to the massive federal conspiracy she had so eagerly helped facilitate. Within minutes, the spectacular chaos began to rapidly subside. The federal agents systematically cleared the grand ballroom, forcefully escorting DeAndre, Chloe, and Elaine out through the heavy double doors and down to the waiting armored transport vehicles idling in the hotel driveway. The wealthy Atlanta socialites, entirely terrified of being legally implicated in the massive cartel money laundering scheme, scrambled frantically for the nearest exits. They abandoned their expensive champagne glasses, their half-eaten plates of catered food, and their designer coats in their desperate rush to escape the federal crime scene. The live jazz band silently packed up their brass instruments and slipped out through the service elevators. The catering staff vanished into the kitchen corridors. The sheer speed of the mass exodus was truly staggering to witness. I did not follow the panicked crowd. I did not rush out to watch my toxic family being shoved into the back of federal transport vans. I simply stood my ground, remaining perfectly still in the exact center of the massive glittering ballroom. The heavy oak doors finally swung shut, sealing off the hallway. The mechanical hum of the massive projector screen slowly retracting back into the ceiling was the only sound remaining. Then the room fell completely silent. I stood entirely alone in the massive, beautifully decorated space. The crystal chandeliers continued to sparkle brightly overhead, casting long, elegant shadows across the empty hardwood dance floor. The air, previously thick with suffocating tension, desperate lies, and malicious greed, suddenly felt incredibly light and breathable. I took a deep breath, inhaling the faint scent of the white roses covering the empty tables. The silence surrounding me was absolute. It was deafening, powerful, and completely uncompromising. But for the very first time in my entire 32 years of existence, the silence did not feel isolating or lonely. It felt incredibly, profoundly peaceful. The empire of lies was officially destroyed. The heavy chains of familial obligation were permanently shattered, and my life finally belonged entirely to me. I smiled warmly. I set my glass down, entirely ready to embrace the brilliant future waiting outside. 6 months later, the suffocating humidity of that unforgettable Atlanta night had been completely replaced by the sterile, freezing air conditioning of a federal courthouse. I sat quietly in the back row of the heavily guarded courtroom, wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit. I was not there as a defendant, nor was I required to testify. I was simply there to witness the final, undeniable conclusion of the empire my family had desperately tried to build on my back. The heavy oak doors swung open, and DeAndre was led into the room by two armed United States Marshals. He was completely unrecognizable. The arrogant entrepreneur who used to strut around in counterfeit designer belts was gone. He wore a standard issue, bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his significantly thinner frame. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished floor with every shuffling step he took. The federal judge presiding over the case did not possess an ounce of sympathy. She read through the staggering list of DeAndre's convicted charges with a cold, monotonous voice that echoed through the silent room. Aggravated identity theft, massive wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering for an international criminal syndicate. When she finally brought her heavy wooden gavel down, the sound was like a gunshot. DeAndre was officially sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. He did not cry this time. He just stared blankly at the wooden table in front of him, the absolute reality of his ruined life finally crushing whatever tiny shred of spirit he had left. He was escorted out of the courtroom through a side door, completely disappearing from my world forever. Chloe miraculously managed to avoid joining her husband in a federal prison cell, but her freedom came at an incredibly steep, humiliating price. During the intense federal interrogations, her self-preservation instincts kicked in violently. She immediately turned state's witness, eagerly handing over every single detail she knew about DeAndre's offshore cartel connections in exchange for total legal immunity from jail time. However, avoiding a prison sentence did not mean she escaped punishment. The federal government seized absolutely every asset she possessed: her luxury cars, her expensive jewelry, her designer wardrobe, and the contents of her bank accounts were completely liquidated to pay off a mountain of court-ordered restitution. She was left entirely bankrupt, possessing nothing but the clothes on her back and a permanently stained criminal record. The golden child. The woman who once demanded I pay a grocery bill because she believed she was fundamentally above hard work was now experiencing the harsh reality of the real world. With zero marketable skills, no college degree, and a highly publicized federal fraud case attached to her name, nobody in the corporate world would even look at her resume. I recently heard through a mutual acquaintance that Chloe is currently working the graveyard shift at a greasy fast food drive-thru on the outskirts of the city. She spends her nights wearing a cheap, flammable polyester uniform, handing bags of cheap burgers to intoxicated teenagers through a sliding glass window, desperately trying to scrape together enough minimum wage to pay off her massive federal fines. The beautiful, untouchable princess of our family had finally been dethroned, permanently banished to the grueling reality of the working-class life she had always so viciously mocked. But Chloe's spectacular fall from grace was nothing compared to the absolute devastation that struck my mother. Elaine had spent her entire life carefully curating an image of pristine upper-middle-class perfection. She cared about the opinions of her wealthy neighbors and her church congregation more than she ever cared about her own children. That illusion of perfection was entirely obliterated. During the height of DeAndre's frantic attempts to secure funding, Elaine had foolishly signed over the deed to her sprawling colonial house in Fairfield, using it as collateral to secure a massive loan for one of his fraudulent shell companies. When the federal government froze DeAndre's assets and the shell companies immediately defaulted, the bank moved in with ruthless efficiency. Elaine was officially evicted. The bank foreclosed on the property she had lorded over me for my entire childhood. I actually drove past the house a few weeks ago out of pure curiosity. The manicured lawn she had obsessed over was entirely overgrown, choked with tall weeds and dead brown grass. A massive, brightly colored foreclosure sign was hammered deeply into the front yard, a highly public beacon of her ultimate failure. Elaine was forced to pack whatever meager belongings the bank allowed her to keep into trash bags and relocate to a tiny, run-down one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood far outside the city limits. Her entire identity, completely anchored to the brick colonial house and the heated swimming pool, was instantly erased. To make matters substantially worse for her, Elaine had become an absolute social pariah within her beloved religious community. The audio recording I played in the church lobby during that chaotic Sunday service had triggered a massive internal investigation by the regional religious board. Reverend Davis was abruptly ousted from his highly lucrative position, stripped of his clerical credentials, and currently facing his own severe legal battles regarding the missing youth ministry funds. The entire congregation, deeply humiliated and financially wounded by the scandal, directed all of their furious outrage entirely at my mother. The very same people who used to sip sweet tea in her living room and compliment her parenting now actively crossed the street to avoid walking near her. She was officially banned from attending Greater Grace Fellowship, stripped of her house, her social status, and her golden child daughter Elaine found herself entirely alone for the very first time in her entire life. The profound isolation quickly drove her to pure desperation. Yesterday evening, as I was sitting in my corner office, reviewing a lucrative new international contract, my personal cell phone buzzed softly on my desk. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, likely an untraceable burner phone she had purchased from a cheap convenience store. Against my better judgment, I let the call go directly to voicemail. A few minutes later, the notification icon appeared on the screen. I put the phone on speaker and pressed play, listening to the trembling, pathetic voice of the woman who had spent decades trying to destroy my spirit. "Nia, please pick up the phone," Elaine sobbed into the receiver, her voice thick with manufactured misery and heavy desperation. "It is your mother. I have absolutely nothing left. The apartment is freezing. My car broke down yesterday, and I cannot even afford to buy groceries for the week. Chloe will not speak to me anymore, and all of my friends have completely abandoned me. I know I made some terrible mistakes, but you have your $9 million now. You are incredibly rich and successful. You cannot just leave your own mother to rot like this in the gutter. Please, Nia." I am begging you. Just send me a few $1,000s to help me get back on my feet. Have some mercy in your heart." I listened to the entire 2-minute message without moving a single muscle. Her words were entirely predictable, a textbook display of narcissistic manipulation. She did not offer a genuine apology for stealing my father's letters. She did not express any remorse for handing over my social security number to a known criminal. She was simply playing the victim card once again, hoping my financial success would magically erase her decades of emotional abuse. She still viewed me as nothing more than a human bank account, a convenient resource to be drained whenever her own foolish choices caught up with her. I reached out and picked up the phone. I did not feel a single drop of guilt, sadness, or obligation. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute liberation. I pressed the delete button, erasing the pathetic voicemail from my device entirely. Then I navigated to the contact settings and permanently blocked the burner number. I knew she would probably buy another cheap phone eventually, but I would simply block that one too. I was completely finished participating in her endless cycle of toxicity. The heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me to that miserable family for 32 years was officially broken, and I was never going to allow them to drag me back down into their darkness. That very same afternoon, I finalized a deeply personal piece of legal paperwork. I sat across from my attorney, David, and signed the final documents to officially and permanently change my legal surname. I completely dropped the last name my mother had given me, the name she had violently weaponized against me for my entire life. I officially became Nia Sterling. I took the name of the brilliant, loving father who had fought for me, provided for me, and ultimately protected me from beyond the grave. It was a profound, quiet victory. I was honoring the man who truly loved me, while simultaneously severing the very last linguistic tie I had to the people who despised me. A few weeks after the federal sting operation concluded, the FBI officially released their hold on my inheritance. The $9 million previously utilized as federally marked bait money to trap DeAndre was entirely cleared of any investigative restrictions. The massive sum was fully restored to my private encrypted trust account, completely unburdened by any legal complications. I did not use the money to buy a flashy mansion in Buckhead, nor did I purchase counterfeit designer clothes to impress strangers. I used the resources exactly how Reginald Sterling would have wanted me to use them. I invested a significant portion of the inheritance directly into my public relations and crisis management firm. I hired a team of elite, highly aggressive attorneys, recruited top-tier digital security analysts, and officially expanded my operations from a successful local business into a massive global agency. We opened new corporate offices in London and Dubai, securing multi-million-dollar retainer contracts with international conglomerates who desperately needed the kind of cold, calculated protection I provided. The company I built from the ground up, the very same company DeAndre had foolishly mocked as a glorified maid service, was now an absolute titan in the corporate sector. I stood up from my glass desk, walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my newly renovated penthouse office. The sprawling skyline of Atlanta stretched out endlessly before me, glowing brightly under the warm afternoon sun. I looked down at the bustling city streets, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of peace settle deeply into my bones. The journey had been incredibly dark, painful, and fraught with unimaginable betrayal. But I had survived the fire entirely on my own terms. I had turned my trauma into an impenetrable armor and my stolen identity into a global empire. I was Nia Sterling, and my brilliant future had finally truly begun. A gentle evening breeze swept across the expansive terrace of my new penthouse, carrying the distant rhythmic hum of the Atlanta traffic far below. I stepped out onto the cool slate tiles holding a steaming mug of herbal tea and leaned against the thick glass railing. The city skyline was a breathtaking tapestry of glittering gold and silver lights stretching endlessly into the dark horizon. It was a spectacular view, one that I had entirely earned through my own relentless dedication and unyielding perseverance. I took a slow, deep breath, allowing the crisp night air to fill my lungs completely. For the first time in my entire life, my mind was utterly quiet. There were no frantic phone calls to manage, no manufactured family crises to solve, and absolutely no degrading insults to quietly absorb. The toxic noise that had served as the constant suffocating soundtrack of my existence had finally been permanently muted. As I stood there looking out over the glowing city, I found myself reflecting deeply on the bizarre, deeply twisted psychology of the golden child and the scapegoat dynamic that had defined my family. Growing up, I genuinely believed her harsh rejection meant absolute personal failure. I sincerely thought my inability to win her affection meant I was inherently broken. But distance and time had finally granted me the absolute clarity I desperately needed. I realized that being the designated outcast was never actually a curse. It was my greatest armor. Because I was never handed a single thing, I was forced to figure out exactly how to build everything myself. I had to become incredibly observant, ruthlessly independent, and mentally unbreakable just to survive the psychological warfare in my own childhood home. Every single time my mother pushed me away, she made me much stronger. She was unintentionally teaching me how to stand firmly on my own 2 feet. While she was busy creating an illusion of perfection, I was busy building a tangible, unshakable foundation for my real life. Conversely, the constant suffocating coddling Elaine had showered upon Chloe had ultimately been a terrible curse disguised as extreme privilege. By protecting her favorite daughter from every single consequence, handing her unearned praise, and fixing all her mistakes, Elaine had effectively crippled her. Chloe never learned how to navigate adversity, how to build genuine personal worth, or how to spot a dangerous fraud like DeAndre. She was raised to be entirely dependent on the efforts of others. And when that artificial support system abruptly collapsed under the heavy weight of a federal indictment, she had absolutely zero internal strength to fall back on. The unearned privilege of being the golden child had left her completely defenseless against the harsh realities of the real world. Walking away from a toxic family is rarely portrayed accurately in popular culture. Society constantly pushes the deeply flawed narrative that blood is thicker than water, insisting that you must forgive and forget simply because you share a genetic lineage altogether. People expect you to tolerate terrible abuse simply because they are your relatives. But I am here to tell you that severing those ties is not a tragedy. It is a profound, absolutely necessary rebirth. Blood does not magically entitle anyone to your hard-earned peace, your pristine credit score, or your carefully guarded sanity. You are absolutely not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. You do not owe your massive success to the horrible people who actively tried to prevent you from achieving it in the very first place during your entire childhood. Choosing to walk away is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It requires you to look the people who brought you into this world directly in the eye and declare that your mental health is significantly more valuable than their comfort. It demands an incredible amount of raw courage to rewrite the terrible narrative they forced upon you and to build a life that reflects your true potential. My biological father, Reginald Sterling, understood that fundamental truth. He loved me enough to protect me from the shadows, and his final gift was not just a very substantial financial inheritance alone. It was the undeniable opportunity to finally break the vicious cycle of abuse and step into my own undisputed power completely. I finished my herbal tea, feeling the soothing warmth spread through my chest. I turned away from the sweeping city views and looked back into my beautiful, peaceful home. The life I have cultivated is completely mine, built on a strong foundation of absolute truth, rigorous boundaries, and unyielding self-respect. I am no longer the unwanted daughter, desperately seeking validation from a cruel mother, entirely incapable of providing it. I am Nia Sterling, a highly formidable crisis manager. I am a loyal friend, a successful software developer, and a strong woman who knows exactly what she brings to the table. No one will ever be allowed to manipulate me, steal from me, or belittle my incredible accomplishments again. My journey was incredibly painful, but it was also profoundly necessary. It taught me how to recognize real love and how to violently reject the fake versions of affection my family used as heavy chains to bind me. I want every single person listening to this to realize that you possess the exact same phenomenal strength residing inside your heart. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but occasionally you have to hand the garbage bags to the feds. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family members who felt entitled to your success? How did you protect your peace? Let me know in the comments below. If this story gave you the strength to stand your ground, hit that like button, subscribe, and remember, your value isn't determined by people who are blind to it. Stay unbothered, stay brilliant. I truly hope my incredibly dark personal experiences can help you navigate your own difficult family struggles.